The desert sun was merciless at high noon, beating down on the endless expanse of Texas scrubland where nothing moved except the vultures circling overhead. This was 1881, when justice was whatever the man with the badge said it was, and mercy was a luxury most folks couldn't afford. But what happened on this scorching day would prove that sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely source. Picture this: a young woman tied to a weathered fence post, left to die under the blazing sun for a crime she didn't commit. Her name was Isabella Santos, though most folks called her Bella, and she was about to discover that the difference between life and death could come down to a single stranger's choice. Bella had always been too proud for her own good. At 25, she could outride most men, outshoot half the cowboys in 3 counties, and had never backed down from a fight in her life. Her father had raised her to believe that Santos land meant something, that their Mexican heritage was worth defending, and that no corrupt lawman would ever drive them from the ranch her grandfather had built with his own hands. But pride can be a dangerous thing in a world where power trumps justice every single time. 3 days earlier, Sheriff Marcus Kane had ridden onto Santos property with 5 deputies and a fabricated warrant, claiming someone had been rustling cattle from the neighboring Anderson spread. The real truth? Anderson wanted Santos water rights, and Sheriff Kane had been bought and paid for like a sack of grain at the general store. When Bella demanded to see proof of their accusations, Kane had smiled that cold smile of his and said the evidence was clear as day. Missing cattle, Santos land bordering Anderson's, and a Mexican family that probably couldn't be trusted anyway. The kind of logic that made perfect sense to men who'd already decided guilt before they'd even arrived. But here's what Sheriff Kane hadn't counted on. Bella Santos didn't break easy. She'd fought them every step of the way, screaming about justice and rights and the law, until Kane finally got tired of listening. That's when he'd ordered his men to tie her to the old fence post at the edge of the desert, where the buzzards liked to roost and the sun could cook a person's brain in their skull. "Let's see how tough you are after a day out here, señorita," Kane had sneered, tipping his hat in mock politeness. "Maybe when we come back tomorrow, you'll be ready to confess to them cattle thefts and save us all some paperwork." Now Bella hung from that post like a scarecrow, her wrists raw and bleeding from the rope, her lips cracked from thirst, and her mind starting to play tricks on her from the heat. She'd been there since dawn, watching the sun climb higher and higher into that endless blue sky, knowing that each minute brought her closer to a death she didn't deserve. But what Sheriff Kane couldn't have known was that someone else was watching too. A rider sat motionless on a ridge half a mile away, so still he might have been carved from the desert stone itself. The locals called him Ghost, though few knew his real name was Jonas Walker. He was the kind of man who moved through the world like smoke. There one moment, gone the next, leaving behind only stories and sometimes bodies. Ghost had been tracking Sheriff Kane for 2 weeks now, following a trail of corruption that led from Austin to El Paso, gathering evidence of bribes and murders and justice sold to the highest bidder. He'd seen plenty of Kane's handiwork, but this was different. This was a woman dying slowly in the desert heat, and something about her defiant posture, even tied and helpless, stirred something in his chest he thought was dead and buried. The smart play was to ride away. Ghost Walker didn't get involved in other people's problems, didn't play hero, and sure as hell didn't rescue damsels in distress. But as he watched that young woman struggling against her bonds, refusing to give up even as the desert tried to claim her, he felt his hand moving toward his knife. Sometimes a man has to choose between who he's been and who he wants to become. And sometimes that choice comes down to whether he'll cut a stranger's ropes or ride away and let the desert have its due. What happened next would change both their lives forever. Jonas Walker had killed his first man when he was 16 years old. It wasn't something he was proud of, wasn't something he liked to remember, but it was a fact as solid and unchangeable as the desert rock beneath his horse's hooves. The man had been trying to rape his sister, and Jonas had put a knife between his ribs without hesitation or regret. That first kill had led to a second, then a third, until somewhere along the way, Jonas Walker had become Ghost Walker, and Ghost Walker had become a legend whispered around campfires and in saloon corners. They said Ghost could track a man across solid stone. They said he could put a bullet through a silver dollar at 100 yards in the dark. They said he'd killed 30 men, maybe 40, and that he moved through the world like death himself, silent, inevitable, unstoppable. Most of those stories were lies, but Ghost had never bothered to correct them. Fear was a useful tool, and reputation could end a fight before it started. Better to let folks think he was the devil incarnate than to have them keep testing whether he was as fast as they'd heard. But watching Isabella Santos fight against those ropes, her dark hair whipping in the desert wind as she refused to give up, even with death breathing down her neck, Ghost felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Something that might have been conscience, if he'd believed he still had one. He'd been tracking Sheriff Marcus Kane for the better part of a month now, following a trail of corruption that stretched from the territorial capital all the way down to the Mexican border. Kane wasn't just crooked, he was poison. The kind of lawman who sold justice to whoever had the deepest pockets and slept sound at night knowing innocent folks died because of his greed. Ghost had been planning to put a bullet in Kane's brain and call it even, but this changed things. This made it personal in a way he hadn't expected. The woman tied to that fence post wasn't some saloon girl or drifter nobody would miss. She was quality. He could tell from the way she held herself, even in extremis. Her clothes were well made but practical, her boots expensive leather, worn smooth by honest work. This was a rancher's daughter, maybe a landowner herself, and that meant Kane had overplayed his hand in a big way. More importantly, it meant she didn't deserve what was happening to her. Ghost urged his horse down the ridge, moving slow and careful to avoid raising dust. The desert was quiet except for the endless whisper of wind through sagebrush and the distant cry of a hawk circling high overhead. No sign of Kane or his deputies. They'd probably ridden back to town to celebrate their morning's work over whiskey and cards, confident that the desert would finish what they'd started. They were about to learn different. As he rode closer, Ghost could see the woman more clearly. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe 25, with the kind of beauty that came from good bones and clean living rather than paint and powder. Her skin was olive dark, speaking to Mexican blood, and her eyes were the deep brown of rich earth after rain. Even half dead from thirst and heat, she had the kind of pride that couldn't be broken by ropes and threats. She saw him coming when he was still 50 yards out, and Ghost watched her tense like a wildcat ready to fight. Good. That kind of spirit would serve her well in what was coming. "Easy there," he called out, his voice rough from disuse. Ghost didn't talk much as a rule. Words were just another thing that could get you killed if you weren't careful with them. But this situation called for some explanation, and he figured the woman deserved to know she wasn't jumping from one danger into another. Well, not exactly. "I ain't here to hurt you," he continued, sliding down from his horse with fluid grace. Up close, he could see the rope burns on her wrists, the way her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration, the defiant tilt of her chin that said she'd rather die fighting than live begging. Yeah, this was definitely not a woman who deserved what Kane had done to her. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse but steady. No pleading, no tears, just a direct question from someone who'd learned not to count on rescue from anybody. "Name's Jonas," he said, pulling his knife from its sheath. The blade was sharp enough to shave with, honed to a razor edge that caught the desert sunlight like captured lightning. "But most folks call me Ghost." Her eyes went wide at that, and Ghost saw recognition flicker across her features. So she'd heard the stories too. Probably figured she was trading one kind of death for another, but at this point any change had to look good. "Ghost Walker?" she whispered, and there was something in her voice that might have been hope or might have been terror. Hard to tell which, and Ghost supposed it didn't much matter. Fear and hope were close neighbors in desperate times. "That's right," he confirmed, moving behind the fence post to get at the ropes. "And you're Isabella Santos, unless I miss my guess. Daughter of Miguel Santos, owner of the Double S spread that borders the Anderson Ranch." She tried to turn her head to look at him, but the ropes wouldn't allow much movement. "How do you know that?" "I know a lot of things," Ghost replied, sawing carefully through the thick hemp that bound her wrists. "I know Sheriff Kane's been taking money from John Anderson to drive Mexican families off their land. I know Anderson's got his eye on your water rights and figures a little manufactured evidence is cheaper than making an honest offer. And I know you didn't steal any cattle, because the cattle that went missing are locked up in Anderson's private canyon, about 10 miles north of here. The ropes parted with a whisper of severed fibers, and Isabella stumbled forward, her legs nearly buckling after hours of being bound upright. Ghost caught her before she could fall, his strong hands steadying her until she found her balance. "Easy now," he murmured, and was surprised by how gentle his voice had become. When was the last time he'd touched another person without violence being involved? When was the last time he'd wanted to? "Why?" Isabella asked, rubbing circulation back into her raw wrists. "Why help me? Everyone knows what kind of man you are, what you do. Why risk yourself for a stranger?" It was a fair question, and one Ghost wasn't entirely sure he could answer. He'd been asking himself the same thing from the moment he decided to ride down that ridge, instead of continuing on his way. But looking at her now, seeing the strength in her dark eyes, the courage that couldn't be broken by corrupt lawmen or desert heat, he knew there wasn't really a choice at all. "Because sometimes a man gets tired of being what everyone expects him to be," he said finally. "And sometimes he sees something worth protecting." Isabella studied his face for a long moment, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle written in the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw. Ghost let her look, though it made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't explain. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at him like he was a person instead of a threat. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we get you some water and some shade," Ghost replied, walking back to his horse and pulling a canteen from his saddlebags. "Then we figure out how to make Sheriff Kane pay for what he's done." Isabella accepted the canteen gratefully, drinking deep but not too fast. Smart girl, she knew enough not to shock her system after being without water for so long. When she'd had her fill, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and fixed Ghost with a look that was equal parts gratitude and determination. "I want more than just payment," she said, her voice stronger now that she had moisture back in her throat. "I want justice, real justice, not the bought and paid for kind Kane's been dealing." Ghost nodded slowly. He'd expected as much from a woman with her kind of backbone. "Justice can be expensive," he warned. "You ready to pay that price?" "I've been ready my whole life," Isabella replied without hesitation. "The question is whether you're the man to help me collect it." Ghost looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something shift inside his chest. Something that had been locked away for so long he'd forgotten it existed. Purpose, maybe, or redemption, or just the simple human need to stand beside someone and fight for what was right instead of what was profitable. "Yeah," he said quietly, settling his hat lower on his brow. "I reckon I am." But as they mounted up and rode toward the shelter of a distant canyon, neither of them saw the figure watching from another ridge. Deputy Tom Walsh lowered his spyglass with a grim smile, wheeled his horse around, and spurred toward town at a hard gallop. Sheriff Kane was going to be very interested to learn that Ghost Walker had just declared war. Sheriff Marcus Kane was pouring his third whiskey of the afternoon when Deputy Walsh burst through the saloon doors like the devil himself was on his heels. The crash of wood against wood made every head in the place turn, and the sudden silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Kane didn't look up from his glass. He'd been celebrating what he figured was a job well done. Isabella Santos would be buzzard food by now, her family would sign over their water rights to avoid further investigation, and John Anderson's check would clear the bank by Friday. It was the kind of clean, profitable work that had made Kane the richest lawman in 3 counties. "Boss," Walsh wheezed, still out of breath from his hard ride. "Boss, we got a problem." "The only problem I got," Kane said slowly, still not looking up, "is a deputy who don't know enough to knock before he comes busting in here like some kind of fool." "You want to try that again, Tom?" But Walsh was too worked up to pay attention to protocol. "She's alive, Sheriff." "The Santos girl. She's alive, and she ain't alone." That got Kane's attention. His hand stopped halfway to his mouth, whiskey sloshing in the glass. And when he finally raised his eyes, they were cold as winter ice. "What did you just say?" "Someone cut her loose," Walsh continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the now silent saloon. "I was riding the north pasture, checking on them stolen cattle like you told me, and I seen it through my spyglass. Man on horseback, black coat and hat, moved like smoke across water. He cut her down, and they rode off together toward Devil's Canyon. Kane set his glass down very carefully, like he was handling dynamite. His mind was racing through possibilities, trying to figure out who would be stupid enough to interfere with his business. Some drifter looking to play hero? One of Santos's vaqueros who'd grown a spine? A federal marshal who'd caught wind of his operations? "You get a good look at this man?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. Walsh swallowed hard, and Kane could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air inside the saloon. "Yeah, boss. I got a real good look. It was Ghostwalker." The name hit the room like a thunderclap. Someone's chair scraped against the floor. A bottle clinked against a glass with nervous fingers. The piano player, who'd been pecking out a half-hearted tune in the corner, let his hands fall silent on the keys. Kane felt something cold settle in his stomach, but he kept his expression neutral. He'd heard of Ghostwalker, of course. Everyone in the territory had heard the stories. A killer who moved through the world like his namesake, taking contracts from men who had money and enemies who needed burying. They said he was faster than lightning with a gun, quieter than death with a knife, and that he'd never failed to complete a job once he'd taken it on. More importantly, they said he didn't work cheap, which meant someone with serious money had hired him. Someone who wanted Marcus Kane dead badly enough to pay Ghostwalker's legendary rates. "You sure it was him?" Kane asked, though he already knew the answer. Walsh might be a coward and a fool, but he had good eyes and a memory for faces. If he said it was Ghostwalker, then that's who it was. "Sure as sunrise," Walsh confirmed. "Matched every description I ever heard. Tall, lean, moves like a cat. Black coat, black hat, black horse. And the way he handled that knife when he cut her loose, I ain't never seen anything like it. Like the blade was part of his hand." Kane pushed back from the table and stood up, his mind already working through the implications. Ghostwalker didn't just randomly stumble across injustices and decide to play hero. That wasn't how men like him operated, which meant someone had hired him, someone who knew about the Santos operation and wanted to stop it. But who? Anderson sure as hell wouldn't hire Ghost to interfere with his own land grab. The territorial governor was in Anderson's pocket deeper than Kane himself. The local federal marshal was either bought off or too drunk most of the time to tie his own boots, let alone investigate corruption. That left someone from outside the territory. Someone with connections and money and a reason to care about one Mexican ranching family in the middle of nowhere, Texas. "Round up the boys," Kane ordered, his voice cutting through the saloon's nervous quiet. "All of them. I want every deputy, every part-timer, every man who's ever worn a badge for me, saddled and ready to ride within the hour." "Boss," Walsh said hesitantly, "maybe we should think about this. I mean, it's Ghostwalker we're talking about. Stories say he's killed more men than a cholera epidemic. Maybe we should just let this one go, write it off as a loss." Kane's hand moved faster than thought, his Colt clearing leather and pressing against Walsh's temple before the deputy could even blink. The click of the hammer being pulled back was loud as a church bell in the sudden silence. "You questioning my orders, Tom?" Kane asked softly. "No, sir," Walsh whispered, his face gone white as new cotton. "Just thinking maybe—" "Don't," Kane interrupted. "Don't think. That ain't what I pay you for. What I pay you for is to follow orders and keep your mouth shut. Can you handle that, or do I need to find myself a new deputy?" "I can handle it, Sheriff." "No problem at all." Kane held the gun in place for another long moment, letting the threat sink in, then slowly holstered the weapon. "Good. Now get moving. And Tom, make sure the boys understand. I don't care if it's Ghostwalker or the Angel Gabriel himself. Nobody interferes with my business and lives to tell about it." As Walsh hurried out to gather the men, Kane walked to the saloon's front window and stared out at the dusty main street. His reflection looked back at him from the glass, a hard-faced man in his 40s with iron gray hair and cold blue eyes that had seen too much and cared too little. He'd built his reputation on being meaner, smarter, and more ruthless than anyone else who wore a badge. And he wasn't about to let some legendary gunfighter ruin everything he'd worked for. But even as he made his plans, Kane couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something bigger than he understood. Ghostwalker didn't just show up randomly to rescue damsels in distress. He was a professional, and professionals didn't work for free or take unnecessary risks, which meant there was more to this than just Isabella Santos and her family's water rights. The question was, what? Meanwhile, 20 miles south in Devil's Canyon, Ghost and Isabella had found shelter in a cave that cut deep into the red sandstone walls. The canyon was a natural fortress, with only one way in or out and plenty of high ground for someone who knew how to use a rifle. More importantly, it had water, a small spring that bubbled up from underground and formed a pool clear as glass. Isabella knelt by the spring, splashing water on her face and neck, washing away the dust and sweat of her ordeal. Ghost kept watch at the cave mouth, his eyes scanning the canyon rim for any sign of pursuit. They'd covered their trail as best they could, but Marcus Kane hadn't survived this long by being careless or stupid. "They'll come," Isabella said without turning around. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," Ghost agreed. "Question is when and how many." Isabella stood and walked to where Ghost crouched by the cave entrance. In the filtered light that slanted through the canyon, she looked different than she had tied to that fence post. Stronger, more dangerous. The kind of woman who could stand beside a man in a fight and not need protection. "You know this was never just about me," she said. "Kane's been working this territory for years, driving out families, stealing land, selling justice to whoever pays the most. My family's just the latest in a long line." Ghost nodded. He'd figured as much from his investigation. "So what do you want to do about it?" Isabella was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the canyon walls painted gold and crimson by the setting sun. When she spoke, her voice was steady as stone. "I want to end it, all of it. Kane, Anderson, the whole corrupt system that lets men like them prosper while good people suffer. I want to burn it down and start over." Ghost studied her profile, seeing something in her face that reminded him of himself at her age. The same anger, the same hunger for justice, the same willingness to pay whatever price was necessary to see things made right. "That's a tall order," he said quietly. "Kane's got the law on his side, at least officially. Anderson's got money and political connections. You're talking about going to war with men who have all the advantages. Then we better make sure we have something they don't," Isabella replied, turning to meet his eyes. "We better make sure we have Ghostwalker." Before he could answer, the distant sound of horses echoing off canyon walls made them both freeze. Ghost moved to the cave mouth and peered out, counting riders silhouetted against the dying light. 8 men, maybe 10, spread out in a line across the canyon entrance. Marcus Kane's voice carried clearly in the desert air. "I know you're in there, Walker. You and the Santos girl. Come out now and maybe we can settle this like civilized men." Ghost felt Isabella move up beside him, her hand resting on the handle of a knife she'd taken from his saddlebags. "Civilized men don't tie women to fence posts and leave them to die," she called back, her voice ringing off the stone walls. Kane's laughter was ugly as a rattlesnake's warning. "Civilized men also don't harbor fugitives and known criminals. You're under arrest, both of you. Come out with your hands up." Ghost's hand moved to his Colt, thumb resting on the hammer. 8-to-1 odds weren't the worst he'd ever faced, but they weren't good either, especially with Isabella to protect and only one way out of the canyon. But as he watched Kane's men spread out to block any escape, Ghost realized something that made him smile grimly in the gathering darkness. Marcus Kane had made the same mistake that had gotten a lot of good men killed over the years. He'd forgotten that sometimes the best way out is through. The first shot came without warning. Deputy Walsh, nervous and trigger-happy, fired his rifle at shadows moving in the cave mouth. The bullet sparked off stone and whined away into the darkness, and in the echo that followed, Ghostwalker smiled like death itself. "That was a mistake," he murmured to Isabella, his voice so quiet it was barely audible over the ringing in their ears. Ghost had been in situations like this before, outnumbered, outgunned, trapped in a place with limited cover and no clear escape route. Most men would panic. Some would surrender. A few would go down fighting and hope to take someone with them. But Ghostwalker wasn't most men. He'd learned long ago that reputation was a weapon just as deadly as any Colt 45, and right now his reputation was about to earn its keep. Because every man in that canyon had heard the stories, and stories had a way of making even brave men hesitate at the worst possible moment. "Stay low and keep to the back of the cave," Ghost told Isabella, checking the loads in his pistol with practiced efficiency. 6 shots. He had 6 shots, and there were at least 8 men out there. Probably 10. In most fights, that would be a death sentence. Good thing this wasn't most fights. "I can shoot," Isabella said, gripping the knife tighter. "I can help." "You can help by staying alive," Ghost replied, moving to a narrow crack in the cave wall that gave him a view of the canyon floor. "And by watching my back. Kane's smart enough to send someone around to the top of the canyon if he can manage it." Outside, Kane's voice echoed off the walls again. "That was your last warning, Walker. Come out now or we come in after you." Ghost cupped his hands around his mouth and called back, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "Marcus Kane. You know who I am. You know what I do. You sure you want to dance with the devil tonight?" There was silence for a long moment, and Ghost could picture Kane out there, weighing his options. The smart play would be to wait for daylight, maybe bring more men. But Kane's pride had been wounded, and wounded pride made men do stupid things. "I got 10 men with rifles," Kane shouted back. "You got what? 6 shots in that hog leg of yours? I like my odds." "Your funeral," Ghost murmured, then raised his voice. "Tell me something, Kane. How much is Anderson paying you to steal Santos land? Must be a lot, considering you're willing to die for it." "I ain't dying tonight, Walker, but you sure as hell are." The attack came all at once, 5 men charging up the narrow path toward the cave, while 3 more provided covering fire from positions along the canyon walls. It was a decent plan, the kind of coordinated assault that might have worked against a normal man trapped in a bad position. But Ghost Walker had stopped being normal the day he put his first bullet in another man's heart. The lead attacker was Deputy Barnes, a heavy-set man with a walrus mustache who fancied himself a gunfighter. He came up the path with his pistol blazing, shooting wild and relying on volume of fire to carry the day. Ghost waited until Barnes was 15 feet away, then put a single shot through the center of his chest. Barnes pitched backward off the path and crashed into the rocks below with a sound like breaking pottery. The second man, a part-time deputy named Collins, tried to be smarter. He used the cover of his fallen partner to advance cautiously, rifle ready. Ghost respected the tactics, even as he put a bullet through Collins' throat, dropping him in a spreading pool of his own blood. But the third man was different. Deputy Hayes was young, maybe 20, with the kind of smooth face that said he'd never killed anyone and wasn't sure he wanted to start tonight. He hesitated at the crucial moment, saw his friends die, and tried to turn back. Ghost let him go. "Run, boy," he called out. "Run fast and don't look back. This ain't your fight." Hayes needed no further encouragement. He dropped his rifle and scrambled back down the path like his boots were on fire, and Ghost turned his attention to the remaining attackers. Kane's covering fire was starting to tell. Bullets whined and sparked around the cave mouth, forcing Ghost to keep low and limit his exposure. But he'd been in worse spots than this, and he had something his enemies didn't. Patience born of experience, and the cold certainty that came from being very good at killing people. The fourth man up the path was Deputy Martinez, a Mexican who'd sold out his own people for Kane's silver. Ghost felt no sympathy as he put a bullet through Martinez's gun hand, sending the man's pistol spinning away into the darkness. Martinez screamed and fell, clutching his ruined fingers, but he was still alive, still breathing, still able to learn from his mistakes if he was smart enough to take the lesson. "Crawl away," Ghost told him. "Crawl away and don't come back." Martinez didn't need to be told twice. That left one man on the path, Deputy Sam Johnson, Kane's right-hand man and the meanest son of a bitch in 3 counties. Johnson was different from the others. He was a killer by nature and choice, the kind of man who enjoyed his work a little too much. He came up that path with murder in his eyes and a double-barreled shotgun in his hands. Ghost's 5th shot took Johnson in the shoulder, spinning him around but not dropping him. The deputy raised his shotgun with his good arm, and Ghost rolled sideways just as both barrels roared like thunder. Buckshot chewed chunks out of the cave wall where he'd been crouching, filling the air with stinging rock fragments. Johnson broke open his shotgun and fumbled for fresh shells, his wounded arm making him clumsy. Ghost rose from behind, cover with his last bullet ready, But something made him pause. Isabella Santos stepped out of the shadows behind Johnson like an avenging angel, the knife Ghost had given her, gleaming in her hand. She moved with deadly silence, and Johnson never knew she was there until the blade slid between his ribs and found his heart. "That's for my father," she whispered as Johnson collapsed, "and for every family you've helped destroy." Ghost stared at her for a moment, seeing something in her eyes that he recognized from his own mirror. The look of someone who'd crossed a line they could never uncross, who discovered they had the capacity for violence when pushed far enough. "You all right?" he asked quietly. Isabella wiped the blade clean on Johnson's vest and handed it back to Ghost. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice shook slightly. "I'm better than fine." The canyon had gone quiet except for the moans of wounded men and the echo of gunshots fading into the night. Ghost reloaded his pistol with smooth efficiency, listening for any sign that more attackers were coming. But the silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of horses moving away at speed. "Kane?" Ghost called out. No answer. "You still there, Sheriff? Or did you run when the shooting started?" Still nothing. Ghost moved to the cave mouth and peered out cautiously. The canyon floor was littered with bodies and wounded men, but there was no sign of Marcus Kane. 3 horses stood riderless near the canyon entrance, their reins trailing in the dust. "He's gone," Isabella said, joining Ghost at the cave mouth. "Ran when he realized you were actually going to win." "Smart of him," Ghost admitted. "Stupid to start this fight, but smart to know when he was beaten." But as they made their way down from the cave, stepping carefully around the dead and wounded, Ghost couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Men like Marcus Kane didn't give up easy, and they sure as hell didn't forget when someone made them look like fools in front of their men. Isabella knelt beside Deputy Hayes, who was cowering behind a boulder with his hands over his head. "You," she said, her voice hard as stone. "Look at me." The young deputy raised terrified eyes to her face. "You tell Kane something for me," Isabella continued. "You tell him that Isabella Santos is done running, done hiding, done letting corrupt lawmen steal from honest families. You tell him that Ghost Walker isn't the only one he has to worry about now." Hayes nodded frantically, still too scared to speak. "And you tell him one more thing," Isabella added, standing and looking down at the deputy with contempt. "You tell him that if he wants to finish this, he knows where to find us. But next time he comes, he better bring more men." Ghost felt something stir in his chest as he watched Isabella Santos transform from rescued victim to avenging angel. This wasn't just about her family's land anymore. This was about justice, real justice, the kind that came from the barrel of a gun and the edge of a blade. As they gathered weapons and supplies from the fallen deputies, Ghost realized that Marcus Kane had made a critical error. He'd assumed that Isabella Santos was just another victim to be intimidated and discarded. He'd never considered that she might be something far more dangerous. He'd never considered that she might be a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. As they rode out of Devil's Canyon under a canopy of stars, Ghost Walker found himself looking forward to tomorrow's fight, because for the first time in years, he wasn't just killing for money or reputation, he was killing for something that mattered. But 20 miles away in the town of Copper Falls, Marcus Kane sat in his office with a bottle of whiskey and a telegraph key, composing a message that would change everything. If Ghost Walker wanted to play hero, then Kane would give him villains worthy of the name. By morning, every bounty hunter, gun hand, and killer for hire in 3 territories would know that Marcus Kane was offering $1,000 for Ghost Walker's head. Dead or alive. The telegram reached every outlaw camp, saloon, and bounty hunter's hideout within 50 miles before the sun came up. Ghost Walker wanted dead or alive, $1,000 reward, last seen Devil's Canyon with Mexican woman. Sheriff M. Kane, Copper Falls, $1,000. That was more money than most men saw in 5 years of honest work, more than enough to retire on if a man was careful with his spending. Within hours, every gun for hire in 3 territories was saddling up and heading toward Copper Falls, drawn by the promise of easy money and the chance to be the man who finally put Ghost Walker in the ground. But Ghost and Isabella were already long gone from Devil's Canyon. They'd ridden hard through the night, following game trails and creek beds that wouldn't show tracks, putting distance between themselves and the scene of their victory. Now they sat around a small fire in a hidden valley 20 miles north, sharing jerky and hardtack while Ghost cleaned his weapons and Isabella studied a hand-drawn map of the territory. 17 men, she said, counting marks she'd made on the paper. That's how many of Kane's people are still alive and dangerous. Deputies, part-timers, men who take his money to look the other way when he needs dirty work done. Ghost looked up from oiling his rifle. You've been keeping track. I've been planning, Isabella corrected. While my father was trying to negotiate with corrupt lawmen and dishonest judges, I was watching, learning, making lists of every man who'd sold his soul to Marcus Kane. There was something in her voice that made Ghost pause in his weapon maintenance. A coldness that hadn't been there before last night. A hardness that spoke of lines crossed and innocence lost. Killing Johnson had changed her, just like Ghost's first kill had changed him all those years ago. Killing changes a person, he said quietly, makes them see the world different. Isabella met his eyes across the fire. Good. The world I used to see was full of justice and fairness, and people doing the right thing because it was right. That world was a lie. This one, the one where might makes right and the strong prey on the weak. This one's real. And if that's the world we're living in, then I better learn its rules fast. Ghost nodded slowly. He tried to warn her, tried to prepare her for what it would feel like to take a human life. But there was no preparing for that moment when you realized you had the capacity to kill, that under the right circumstances you were capable of ending another person's existence without hesitation or regret. What's your plan? He asked. Isabella traced a finger along the map, following roads and trails that connected the scattered ranches and settlements of the territory. Kane's power comes from fear and corruption. He's got judges in his pocket, politicians on his payroll, businessmen who profit from his dirty work. But all of that depends on people believing he's untouchable, that crossing him means death or ruin. And we're going to prove them wrong. One corrupt official at a time, one crooked deal at a time, one bought judge at a time. We're going to tear down his whole network and show people that Marcus Kane bleeds just like everybody else. Ghost considered this. It was ambitious, dangerous, and would likely get them both killed before they made any real progress. It was also the right thing to do, which made it exactly the kind of impossible crusade that appealed to his newly awakened conscience. That's a tall order for two people, he pointed out, especially with half the territory's gun hands hunting us for that bounty money. Then we better make sure we're worth the price they're asking, Isabella replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Before Ghost could answer, the distant sound of horses made them both freeze. Multiple riders moving fast, heading in their direction. Ghost grabbed his rifle and moved to the edge of their camp, peering through the scrub brush at the trail below. 4 men rode past their hiding spot, moving at a steady lope toward the south. Bounty hunters from the look of them. Hard-faced men with an assortment of weapons and the kind of clothes that had seen too many miles and not enough washing. One of them wore a necklace made of human ears, and Ghost felt his jaw clench at the sight. Comancheros, he murmured to Isabella as the riders disappeared around a bend. The worst kind of bounty hunters. They'll kill anyone who gets in their way and sell the survivors to slavers down in Mexico. Isabella's hand moved to the knife at her belt. How many more will come? Too many, Ghost admitted. Word spreads fast when there's that kind of money involved. By tomorrow, this whole territory will be crawling with men looking to cash in on our heads. They broke camp quickly and moved deeper into the hills, following deer paths and cattle trails that would be hard to track. But Ghost knew they couldn't run forever. Eventually, they'd have to make a stand, and when that happened, they'd need every advantage they could get. As they rode, Isabella told him about her family's ranch, the double S spread that her grandfather had carved out of the wilderness with nothing but determination and hard work. Her father Miguel had expanded it, building relationships with neighboring ranchers and creating a small community of Mexican families who'd found prosperity in the harsh Texas landscape. Then Anderson had started eyeing their water rights, and everything had begun to fall apart. It started small, Isabella explained as they navigated a narrow canyon that cut through red sandstone cliffs. Cattle wandering onto Anderson's land and not wandering back. Fences cut in the night. wells mysteriously drying up or getting poisoned. My father kept trying to handle it through legal channels, filing complaints with the territorial government, hiring lawyers from Austin. Lawyers don't stop bullets, Ghost observed. No, they don't. But my father was an honorable man who believed in doing things the right way, even when the right way meant losing everything we'd worked for. Isabella's voice carried a note of frustration, mixed with love and loss. He died still believing that justice would prevail, that good men would triumph over evil if they just kept fighting fair. And now I know better. Justice doesn't prevail, it's taken. Good doesn't triumph over evil. It beats evil to death with its bare hands and buries the body where no one will find it. They made camp that evening in a box canyon with high walls and only one entrance, easily defended if they were discovered, but also a potential trap if they were surrounded. Ghost took the first watch while Isabella tried to rest, but he could tell from her breathing that sleep wasn't coming easy. "You having second thoughts?" he asked after an hour of listening to her toss and turn. Isabella sat up, firelight dancing across her face. "About what we're doing?" "Number. About what I've become? Maybe." Ghost understood. The transition from victim to killer, from someone who believed in justice to someone who dispensed it personally, was never easy. It changed you at a fundamental level, rewrote the rules you live by, forced you to confront aspects of yourself you never knew existed. "I never wanted to be this person," Isabella continued, staring into the fire. "Growing up, I dreamed of being a teacher, maybe a doctor. I wanted to help people, to build things instead of destroying them. But then Anderson started his campaign against us, and Cain showed his true colors, and I realized that sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to become something you never wanted to be." Ghost moved closer to the fire, settling beside her on the rough ground. "My sister used to say something when we were kids. She said that heroes aren't people who never have to make hard choices. They're people who make the hard choices anyway, even when it costs them something they can't afford to lose." "What happened to her?" Ghost was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "Cholera epidemic swept through our town when I was 19. Took her, my parents, most of the people I'd ever cared about. I was out hunting when it hit, came back to find half the town dead and buried in mass graves. I'm sorry. After that, I didn't much care what happened to me. Started taking jobs that decent men wouldn't touch, killing people who probably deserved it, but might not have. Figured if the world was cruel and random, then I might as well profit from the cruelty." Isabella studied his profile in the firelight. "What changed?" "You," Ghost said simply. "Seeing you tied to that fence post, watching you refuse to break, even when death was staring you in the face, it reminded me that there are still things worth fighting for, people worth protecting. Made me remember that there's a difference between being a killer and being a killer for the right reasons." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the desert wind whisper through the canyon walls. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and another answered from a different direction. The sound seemed to emphasize their isolation. Two people alone against a world that wanted them dead. "What happens after?" Isabella asked eventually. "After we deal with Cain and Anderson and all the corrupt officials in their network, what happens to us?" It was a fair question. One Ghost had been asking himself since the moment he'd cut her loose from that fence post. What did happen to two people who'd chosen violence as their path to justice? Could they ever go back to being normal, peaceful citizens? Could they build something together out of the ashes of their enemies? "I don't know," he admitted. "I never planned that far ahead before. Never had reason to think about tomorrow beyond staying alive through today." Isabella leaned against his shoulder, and Ghost felt something warm settle in his chest at the contact. It had been a long time since he'd allowed anyone close enough to touch him. Longer still since that touch had meant comfort instead of violence. "Maybe that's enough for now," she said softly. "Maybe it's enough to have someone to fight beside, someone who understands what we're fighting for." Ghost looked down at her, seeing strength and vulnerability warring in her dark eyes. She was beautiful, yes, but it was a dangerous kind of beauty, the beauty of a knife blade or a well-made rifle. Deadly and elegant, and absolutely uncompromising. He was falling in love with her, he realized. Maybe had been since the moment he'd seen her refuse to break under Kane's torture. It was inconvenient, dangerous, and probably doomed to end badly, but it was also the most real thing he'd felt in years. "Isabella," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers. "I know." When she kissed him, it tasted like gunpowder and determination, like blood and desert wind, and the promise of violence to come. It was the kiss of two people who'd chosen a hard path and were determined to walk it together, whatever the cost. But even as Ghost lost himself in the warmth of her lips and the strength of her arms around his neck, part of his mind remained alert, listening to the night sounds of the desert. And beneath the whisper of wind and the distant howl of coyotes, he thought he heard something else, the sound of horses moving in the darkness, drawing ever closer to their hidden canyon. The bounty hunters had found their trail. The kiss ended abruptly as Ghost's head snapped toward the canyon mouth, every instinct screaming danger. Isabella felt the change in him immediately, the way his muscles tensed, how his breathing shifted from the soft rhythm of intimacy to the controlled pattern of a predator preparing to strike. "How many?" she whispered, her hand already moving to her knife. Ghost cocked his head, listening to sounds only years of staying alive in hostile territory had taught him to recognize. Boot leather on stone, the soft jingle of spurs being deliberately muffled, the whispered curse of a man who'd stubbed his toe in the dark. "6, maybe 7, he murmured back, easing away from the dying fire. "Spread out across the canyon mouth. Professional job. They've done this before." Isabella felt her heart racing, but it wasn't fear. It was something else, something darker and more primal. The thrill of the hunt, the electric anticipation of violence about to unfold. 3 days ago, the thought of armed men coming to kill her would have sent her into a panic. Now it made her smile. "The Comancheros from this afternoon?" she asked, checking the loads in the pistol Ghost had given her. "Probably, along with whoever else picked up our trail." Ghost moved with liquid silence to their supply packs, pulling out ammunition and an extra knife. "They're trying to box us in. Classic canyon ambush. Problem is, they think we don't know they're coming." "Their mistake," Isabella said, and Ghost heard something in her voice that made him look at her sharply. There was a cold anticipation there, a hunger for violence that matched his own. The transformation was complete now. Isabella Santos, the rancher's daughter, was gone, replaced by someone harder, deadlier, and far more dangerous. A voice echoed off the canyon walls, distorted by the stone but recognizable as the leader of the bounty hunters they'd seen earlier. "Ghostwalker, we know you're in there. Come out peaceful-like, and maybe the woman don't have to suffer." Ghost almost laughed at that. These men had no idea what Isabella was capable of now. No concept of how thoroughly she'd embraced her new nature. They still saw her as a victim to be rescued or a prize to be claimed, not as a killer in her own right. "What do you think, darling?" Ghost called back, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Should we come out peaceful-like?" "I think," Isabella replied loudly enough for the bounty hunters to hear, "that they should have brought more men." The leader's laughter was ugly, full of confidence and cruel anticipation. "You got spirit, señorita. I like that in a woman. Tell you what, you come out on your own, and I'll make sure you die quick when this is over." "Counteroffer," Isabella shouted back. "You ride away now, and I'll make sure some of you live to see morning." The silence that followed was broken by whispered conferences among the bounty hunters. Ghost could picture them trying to figure out if the Mexican woman was bluffing or if she was genuinely dangerous. By the time they decided it didn't matter either way, it would be too late. Ghost had been studying the canyon walls while they talked, looking for advantages, escape routes, anything that might tip the odds in their favor. The box canyon was mostly sheer stone, but there were ledges and handholds that a skilled climber might use. More importantly, there were shadows, deep pools of darkness, where a man could move unseen if he knew what he was doing. "I'm going up," he told Isabella, pointing to a series of rocky outcroppings that led toward the canyon rim. "Give me 5 minutes, then start shooting. Keep them focused on the camp." Isabella studied the route he'd indicated, then looked back at his face. That's a 60-foot climb in the dark with men shooting at you. One slip and you're dead. I don't slip, Ghost said simply. It wasn't boasting. It was a statement of fact based on 20 years of staying alive in situations that should have killed him. And if you do? Ghost leaned close and kissed her again, quick and hard. Then you make them pay for it. He was gone before she could argue, melting into the shadows like his namesake. Isabella watched him go, then turned her attention back to the canyon mouth where their enemies waited. 7 men, Ghost had estimated. 7 professional killers with rifles and the advantage of numbers and position. Under normal circumstances, it would be suicide for 2 people to fight them. Good thing these weren't normal circumstances. Isabella moved to a new position behind a fallen boulder, taking her rifle and settling into a prone shooting stance. The moon was rising, painting the canyon walls silver and creating perfect contrast between light and shadow. She could see movement now, dark figures positioning themselves for the final assault. 5 minutes, Ghost had said. She started counting. When she reached 300, Isabella Santos opened fire. Her first shot took the bounty hunter creeping along the left wall, a thin man with a scraggly beard who fell without making a sound. The crack of her rifle echoed off the stone like thunder, and suddenly the canyon erupted in muzzle flashes and shouting men. Return fire chipped stone all around her position, forcing Isabella to keep her head down. But she'd seen enough to confirm Ghost's count. 7 men, spread out in a rough semicircle across the canyon mouth. Professional killers, but also predictable in their tactics. They were focusing their fire on her position, trying to pin her down while someone flanked around to finish the job. It was exactly what Ghost had expected them to do. High above on the canyon rim, Ghost Walker moved like death in the moonlight. The climb had been treacherous, loose stone and crumbling handholds that would have sent a lesser man plummeting to his death. But Ghost had learned to move in darkness and silence during his years as a bounty hunter, and those skills served him well now. He reached the rim just as Isabella opened fire below. The sound of gunshots provided perfect cover for his movements as he made his way along the edge of the canyon, looking for the perfect shooting position. There, a narrow ledge about 30 feet above the canyon floor, directly behind where the bounty hunters had positioned themselves. Ghost could see all 7 men from here, could pick them off one by one like shooting fish in a barrel. But that wasn't the plan. The plan was to even the odds, to create chaos and confusion that Isabella could exploit. Ghost wanted these men to know they were being hunted, wanted them to feel the same terror their victims had felt. He started with the leader, the man with the necklace of human ears who'd been giving orders. Ghost's rifle spoke once, and the leader pitched forward with a hole through his spine. The man next to him turned in confusion, trying to figure out where the shot had come from, and Ghost put a second bullet through his chest. Now the remaining bounty hunters knew they were caught in a crossfire, but they couldn't see Ghost's position in the darkness above. They started shooting wildly at the canyon walls, their muzzle flashes revealing their positions to Isabella below. She didn't waste the opportunity. Her rifle cracked again, and another bounty hunter went down with a scream that echoed off the stone walls. 4 left now, and they were starting to panic. "Where is he?" one of them shouted. "Where's the son of a bitch shooting from?" Ghost smiled grimly and put a bullet through the shouter's hat, close enough to part his hair. The man dove for cover behind a boulder, but Isabella had him bracketed from below. Her shot took him in the leg, spinning him around and sending him sprawling in the dust. 3 left. The remaining bounty hunters tried to retreat, but Ghost was already moving along the rim, cutting off their escape route. His rifle spoke twice more in quick succession, and 2 more men fell to the canyon floor. That left just one, a young man, maybe 25, who threw down his rifle and raised his hands in surrender. "Don't shoot," he called out, his voice cracking with fear. "I give up. I surrender." Ghost dropped down from the canyon rim with practiced ease, landing behind the surviving bounty hunter with barely a sound. The man spun around, eyes wide with terror, as he found himself face to face with the legendary Ghost Walker. "Please," the man whispered. "I got a wife, kids back in San Antonio. I just needed the money." "What's your name?" Ghost asked quietly. Billy Morrison." "Well, Billy Morrison," Ghost said, his voice conversational despite the rifle in his hands. You picked the wrong bounty to collect. See that woman down there? He nodded toward Isabella, who was approaching with her own rifle ready. That's Isabella Santos. Her family's been terrorized, their land stolen, their lives destroyed by the man who put that bounty on my head. You come here looking to cash in on our deaths, and now you want mercy? Billy swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. I didn't know. I just heard about the money. Isabella reached them, her dark eyes studying Billy with the same expression a hawk might use to examine a mouse. He's young, she observed. Probably hasn't killed as many innocent people as the others. Probably not, Ghost agreed. Question is, what do we do about it? Billy looked between them, hope and terror warring in his expression. These two people held his life in their hands, and he knew that whatever decision they made would be final and absolute. Isabella stepped closer to Billy, close enough that he could see the hardness in her eyes, the transformation that violence and loss had wrought in her soul. You want to live, Billy Morrison? Yes, ma'am, he whispered. Then you listen very carefully. You're going to ride back to San Antonio, to your wife and children. You're going to tell everyone you meet along the way that Ghost Walker and Isabella Santos are not to be trifled with. You're going to spread the word that we're coming for Marcus Kane and John Anderson and every corrupt official in this territory, and that anyone who stands in our way will end up like your friends here. Billy nodded frantically. Yes, ma'am, I will. I promise. And Billy! Isabella's voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than any shout. If I ever see you hunting innocent people again, if I ever hear that you've taken money to hurt families like mine, I will find you. And when I do, I won't be nearly as merciful as I'm being tonight. I understand, Billy gasped. I swear on my children's lives, I'll never hunt bounties again. Isabella nodded and stepped back. Then go. Take your horse and ride. Don't look back. Don't stop to bury your friends. Don't do anything but get as far away from here as you can, as fast as you can. Billy didn't need to be told twice. He stumbled toward his horse, mounted with shaking hands, and spurred away into the night. Within minutes, the sound of hoofbeats had faded to nothing, leaving Ghost and Isabella alone among the dead. They stood together in the moonlight, surrounded by the bodies of men who'd come to kill them for money. Isabella felt no remorse, no guilt over the violence they'd unleashed. These men had chosen their path, just as she had chosen hers. 7 bounty hunters, she said, surveying the carnage. How many more will come? Fewer than before, Ghost replied, reloading his rifle. Word will spread about what happened here. Some men will decide the $1,000 isn't worth dying for. And the others? Ghost looked at her, seeing moonlight reflected in her dark eyes, seeing the woman who'd emerged from the ashes of her former life. Beautiful and deadly, and absolutely uncompromising in her pursuit of justice. The others will learn what Billy Morrison learned tonight, he said, that Isabella Santos is not a victim to be rescued or a prize to be claimed. She's a force of nature, and forces of nature don't negotiate. Isabella smiled at that, the kind of smile that would have sent Billy Morrison running even faster if he'd seen it. Good, she said, because tomorrow we start hunting Marcus Kane in earnest, and I want him to know exactly what's coming for him. As they gathered weapons and supplies from the dead bounty hunters, preparing to leave the canyon behind, Ghost found himself thinking about the kiss they'd shared before the violence began. It had tasted like gunpowder and promises, like blood and desert wind, and the certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. He was in love with a killer, and she was in love with him. It was probably the most honest relationship either of them had ever had. 3 days later, Ghost and Isabella rode into Copper Falls at high noon like avenging angels come to judgment. The main street emptied as word spread of their arrival. Shopkeepers slammed shutters closed, women grabbed their children and hurried indoors, and men who'd been lounging on porches suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. By the time they reached the center of town, Ghost and Isabella might as well have been riding through a ghost town, which was exactly what they'd wanted. They'd spent those 3 days methodically dismantling Marcus Kane's network of corruption. Judge Whitmore, who'd been taking Anderson's money to rubber stamp fraudulent land seizures, had been found in his chambers with a single bullet through his heart and a list of his crimes pinned to his chest. Mayor Collins, who'd been skimming tax money to fund Kane's operations, had suffered a similar fate outside his home. 3 corrupt businessmen, 2 crooked lawyers, and a territorial land commissioner had all met their maker in the space of 72 hours. The message was clear. The old system was dead, and a new kind of justice had come to the territory. Now they sat their horses in the middle of Main Street, directly in front of the sheriff's office, waiting. Ghost kept his rifle across his saddle, ready but not threatening. Isabella had her pistol holstered, but her hand resting on the grip. They looked like what they were. 2 people who'd come to finish what they'd started. The sheriff's office door opened slowly, and Marcus Kane stepped out onto the wooden boardwalk. He looked older than he had a week ago. The weight of fear and sleepless nights etched into the lines around his eyes. But his hand was steady on his gun, and his voice didn't shake when he spoke. "Ghost Walker," he said. "Isabella Santos. I've been expecting you." "Have you now?" Ghost replied, his voice carrying clearly in the unnatural silence that had fallen over the town. "And what exactly were you expecting, Sheriff?" Kane's smile was thin and cold. "I was expecting you to come for me like the killers you are. What I wasn't expecting was for you to murder half the territorial government in the process." "Murder?" Isabella's voice was like ice. "We prefer to think of it as pest control." Behind Kane, the office door opened again, and John Anderson stepped out. The wealthy rancher looked nervous but determined, a shotgun cradled in his arms. He'd clearly decided that his only chance of survival lay in making a stand alongside the corrupt sheriff he'd been bribing for years. "This ends now," Anderson declared, though his voice lacked conviction. "You two have terrorized this territory long enough. It's time for law and order to prevail." Ghost almost laughed at that. Law and order? From the man who's been stealing water rights and bribing officials? From the sheriff who ties innocent women to fence posts and leaves them to die? "That was necessary," Kane said, his hand moving closer to his gun. "You don't understand the bigger picture here. This territory needs strong men making hard decisions. Weak families like the Santos clan, they hold back progress. They keep good land from being developed, keep resources from being properly utilized." "By good land, you mean our ancestral ranch," Isabella said, her dark eyes blazing with controlled fury. "By proper utilization, you mean stealing it for a fraction of its worth and driving families into poverty or exile." Anderson raised his shotgun slightly. "Your people don't belong here anyway. This is American territory now, not some Mexican province. You should be grateful we're offering to buy you out, instead of just taking it by force." That was when Isabella's control finally snapped. She was off her horse and moving before either man could react, drawing her pistol in one fluid motion. Anderson's shotgun swung toward her, but Ghost's rifle cracked first, taking the rancher in the shoulder and spinning him around. Anderson's wild shot went high, blowing splinters from the roof overhang. Isabella's first bullet caught Anderson's center mass, dropping him to his knees. Her second shot ended his involvement in the conversation permanently. Kane's gun cleared leather a heartbeat later, but he was facing Ghost Walker at 20 paces, and that was a contest with only one possible outcome. Ghost's Colt appeared in his hand like magic, flame belching from the barrel twice in rapid succession. The first bullet took Kane in the chest, staggering him backward against the office wall. The second bullet, fired almost as an afterthought, punched through his heart and ended one of the most corrupt careers in territorial law enforcement. Marcus Kane slid down the wall, leaving a bloody smear on the weathered wood, and died with his eyes fixed on Isabella Santos, the woman he tried to murder and who had instead become the instrument of his destruction. The gunfight had lasted less than 10 seconds. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Ghost reloaded his pistol with practiced efficiency, scanning the street for any sign that more enemies were waiting to make their play. But the few faces he could see in windows and doorways looked more relieved than hostile. Word of their campaign against corruption had spread, and most of the honest citizens in Copper Falls had been waiting years for someone to clean house. Isabella holstered her weapon and walked over to Kane's body. She looked down at the man who'd terrorized her family, who'd stolen their land and murdered their friends, who represents everything wrong with the territory's power structure. She felt no satisfaction in his death, no sense of completion or closure. She felt empty. "Is it over?" she asked Ghost, not looking away from Kane's still form. Ghost joined her on the boardwalk, his boots loud in the continuing silence. This part is. Kane's dead, Anderson's dead, most of their network is scattered or buried. The Santos Ranch legally belongs to your family again. I made sure of that when we eliminated Judge Whitmore. Isabella nodded slowly. And what about us? What happens to Ghost Walker and Isabella Santos now that the killing is done? It was the question Ghost had been dreading, the one he'd been avoiding thinking about during their campaign of justice and revenge. What did two people who'd found each other in violence do when the violence ended? Could they build something normal and peaceful together, or were they forever bound to the darkness they'd embraced? Before he could answer, a voice called out from down the street. "Excuse me, Mr. Walker, Miss Santos." They turned to see a small, nervous-looking man in a dusty suit hurrying toward them. He clutched a leather satchel in one hand and mopped his sweating face with a handkerchief held in the other. "My name is Henderson," the man panted as he reached them. "Theodore Henderson, attorney from Austin. I've been trying to catch up with you for 3 days." Ghost's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. "What do you want, counselor?" Henderson raised his free hand in a peaceful gesture. "Nothing threatening, I assure you." "Quite the opposite, in fact. I represent certain interests in the territorial capital who've been watching your activities with great interest." "What kind of interests?" Isabella asked suspiciously. Henderson glanced around at the bodies and the watching faces in the windows, then lowered his voice. "The kind that believe this territory needs a new sheriff, someone with a reputation for honest dealing and an allergy to corruption, someone who understands that justice doesn't always come from a courtroom." Ghost stared at the little lawyer for a long moment. "You're offering me Kane's job?" "Not just his job, his authority, his territory, his opportunity to build something better. The territorial governor is prepared to offer you a full pardon for any past indiscretions, along with a badge and the backing to clean up 3 counties' worth of corruption." Isabella looked at Ghost, seeing something shift in his expression. "What about me?" Henderson smiled nervously. "Well, every sheriff needs a deputy, doesn't he? Someone who knows the local families, speaks the languages, understands the land disputes that have been festering for years. The job comes with a house, steady pay, and the legal authority to make the changes this territory desperately needs." Ghost was quiet for a long time, staring down at Marcus Kane's body. Sheriff Ghost Walker, it had a certain ring to it. More importantly, it offered something he'd never had before, a chance to use his skills for building instead of just destroying, to protect instead of just hunting. "What do you think?" he asked Isabella. She looked around at the town that had watched her family suffer, that had stood by while corrupt men destroyed innocent lives. But she also saw potential, the chance to make sure no other family endured what hers had, the opportunity to transform a system instead of just tearing it down. "I think," she said slowly, "that Sheriff Walker and Deputy Santos have a nice ring to them." Henderson beamed with relief. "Excellent. I have all the paperwork right here, along with your badges and a substantial budget for hiring additional deputies. The territorial government is very eager to see you succeed." As Henderson bustled around with forms and official documents, Ghost and Isabella stood together on the boardwalk where their enemies had died. The sun was setting, painting the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, and somewhere in the distance a church bell was ringing the evening hour. "No more running," Isabella said quietly. "No more killing for money," Ghost agreed. "Just justice. Real justice. The kind that protects families instead of destroying them." Ghost took her hand, feeling the calluses on her palm from their recent violence, the strength that had carried her through darkness into light. "Think we can make it work? Build something good out of all this blood and death?" Isabella smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Ghost had seen on her face since the day he'd cut her loose from that fence post. "I think we can try. And if we fail, at least we'll fail together." They were married 3 months later, in the same church where Marcus Kane's victims had once prayed for justice that never came. Sheriff Ghost Walker and Deputy Isabella Walker, the name struck fear into the hearts of corrupt officials throughout the territory and hope into the hearts of honest families who'd waited too long for protection. The legend of Ghost Walker didn't end when he pinned on a badge. If anything, it grew stronger, spreading across the frontier like wildfire. They said he was the fastest gun in 3 territories, that he could track a man across solid rock, that he'd cleaned up the most corrupt county in Texas and made it safe for decent folks to raise their children. But the people who knew them best, the families they'd saved, and the communities they'd protected, told a different story. They said Sheriff Walker was a man who'd found redemption in love and purpose in justice. They said Deputy Walker was a woman who'd turned her pain into strength and her anger into protection for others. And sometimes on quiet evenings, when the desert wind whispered through the streets of Copper Falls, old-timers would tell stories about the day 2 people rode into town seeking justice and found something even more valuable. They found each other. And that's how Isabella Santos went from being tied to a fence post and left to die to becoming Deputy Walker, one of the most feared and respected law officers in the American frontier. Sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the worst circumstances, and sometimes justice comes from the most unlikely places. Ghost Walker could have ridden away that day. He could have left Isabella to her fate and continued his solitary life as a killer for hire. But something about her refusal to break, her determination to fight even when death was staring her in the face, awakened something in him he thought was lost forever. Love, purpose, the desire to build instead of just destroy. Their story reminds us that redemption is possible for anyone willing to fight for it, that love can bloom even in the darkest circumstances, and that sometimes the people society writes off as lost causes are exactly the ones who end up saving everyone else. What did you think of Ghost and Isabella's journey from victims to vigilantes to legitimate law enforcement? Could you see yourself making the same choices they made? Would you have had the courage to stand up to corruption the way they did? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing what you think about these classic frontier tales. If you enjoyed this story of justice, redemption, and love conquering all odds, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest Wild West adventures. We've got more incredible tales of courage, romance, and frontier justice coming your way, including the story of a female bounty hunter who tracked down her husband's killer across 3 states, and a Texas Ranger who fell in love with a woman everyone thought was an outlaw. These are the stories that build America. Tales of ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when they needed it most. Thanks for riding along with us on this adventure, and we'll see you in the next one, partner. Like this video if you believe love is stronger than hate, and subscribe for more legendary frontier stories that prove the human spirit can overcome anything.